Right. I think we can start. Thank you again for joining us in person and online for this briefing by Dr. Alice Edwards, who's a UN Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment or punishment. I know you all know that, but special rapporteurs are independent experts of what we call the special procedures of the Human Rights Council. Dr. Edwards will brief you about her most recent report, which she has just, I believe, concluded presenting to the Third Committee of the General Assembly. So without further ado, Dr. Edwards, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your interest in my report from this year, which touches on the very important topic of sexual torture. There are two parts to the report. I present in the first part my global trends and developments, which goes through a range of problematic practices as well as some good practices that states have developed over the past year. And the second part of the report, the longer part of the report, deals with the issue of sexual torture. And that report, just to get down to business, is calling for a fundamental rethinking about how we engage with victims and survivors on the question of sexual violence in wartime. And it puts forward the proposal that we should be capturing most of these violations as forms of torture, and there are great advantages to doing that. And firstly, and I'll go through 6 advantages. Firstly, the torture framework is an internationally binding obligation. There are no exceptions, no amnesties, no immunities. Importantly, there's no statutes of limitations can be applied either to the investigation and prosecution or to rehabilitation for victims and survivors, which is not the same for the prosecution of sexual offences under domestic law, which generally have short time frames. The second important point is that the prohibition on torture is an inclusive framework. And while I acknowledge the Security Council Resolution 1325 and subsequent resolutions, as well as the Women, Peace and Security agenda and the great strides that have been taken to raise the profile of these issues, and also make sure that women and girls are able to participate in all peacetime and peace-building and security initiatives. The reality is that sexual torture is not only committed against women and girls. They still bear the great brunt of this, but recent conflicts have provided ample evidence to show that men and boys, as well as persons of LGBTIQ backgrounds, are also affected, children included, as well as soldiers and civilians. So the torture framework is not an exclusive framework, it is an inclusive framework, and therefore we should see the proper accounting for such crimes. The third area I wanted to mention is, one of the great blockages to why sexual violence crimes are either underreported or under-investigated is because of the shame and stigma attached to these types of violations. And what is very liberating about calling these violations torture is that there is no shame in torture. Victims of torture do not feel shamed. The community does not shame victims of torture. Often they are embraced by the community as survivors of the conflict, as heroes, etc. So in reframing sexual violence as sexual torture, I believe this will redirect that shame from the victims to where it should belong, which is on the perpetrators. The fourth area is this question of consent. Sexual offences, especially and in particular cases of rape, in a legal sense require this question of consent. The element of consent is not relevant to the crime of torture. We do not, for example, ask victims of torture whether they consented to the beatings, whether they consented to the humiliation, whether they consented to the egregious practices. So those same approaches should be applied to women and others who face rape in the context of armed conflict. The fifth area is that I think there are great tools that have been developed in the torture field, the Istanbul Protocol on the investigation and documentation of torture, both physical and psychological, as well as the more recent Mendes guidelines on interviewing techniques, really add and contribute to a professionalization of dealing with these types of crimes. And the final areas in the context of rehabilitation, there are binding obligations on states under Article 14 of the Convention Against Torture to provide rehabilitation and compensation to victims of torture. That there isn't an equivalent for victims of sexual violence, so this is a very strong protection for victims and survivors. So the framework and the report go into more detail. I think I'll leave it there for the purposes of questions. In terms of trends and developments, there is a summary available to the press that is available and has been circulated, I believe. But what we're seeing is obviously increased rates of torture because of increased rates of armed conflict, 120 conflicts going on in the world right now, which puts people at enhanced risk of being a victim of either threats or actual torture. I have intervened over this past year in a wide range of cases relating to protests, squashing political opposition through torture, hostage diplomacy and hostage-taking, prison conditions, which remains very problematic in a whole range of countries, issues particularly affecting women and girls, death row cases in multiple jurisdictions, and other vulnerable groups, in particular refugees. And of course, you'll be aware that I've intervened on several times in relation to the torture, alleged torture and other inhuman cruelty committed by Russian forces in the context of the Ukraine conflict. I did carry out a country visit last year. I've also intervened in relation to Sudan. I've been vocal in relation to the Hamas-led attacks in Israel on the 7th of October, as well as having investigated allegations that I find credible of allegations of torture and other cruel treatment against Palestinians in Israeli detention, including a very serious case that is currently being investigated of multiple offender rape. And I've also been pushing Syria to implement the provisional measures issued by the International Court of Justice to ensure that they stop torture and that they preserve evidence for the purposes of those proceedings. So I think I'll leave it there, but obviously it's a global mandate, it's broad-ranging, and regrettably torture is found almost everywhere these days, and there's a lot of work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. We'll go to questions. We'll begin on the floor. Gabriel?
Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for your briefing. You do have a big mandate, quite global. Gabriel Elizondo from Al Jazeera English. There's a lot to talk about here, but I just want to follow up on, you said you had been investigating what you called credible reports of Palestinians being victims of torture and or sexual violence, I believe. Can you speak more about what your findings were or what you've explored on that front? And then I have a follow-up.
You want me to make it? Thanks very much for the question. So over a number of months, I carried out fact-finding and collected information, and also received information from a number of sources which I consider to be credible, including sources that still have access to some of the facilities, both military facilities and prisons in Israel. And I have sent and the allegation letter is now public. I find that there were two parts to that letter. One is around general conditions and the treatment of Palestinians, a serious attempt to diminish conditions, some being diminished because of the very large numbers of people and being held in temporary facilities rather than in prisons, but nonetheless a clear intention to and statements to reduce basic standards of treatment that are expected under the Nelson Mandela rules for all detainees, including Palestinians, but in this context targeting Palestinians. And then on the other hand, allegations that I received relating to mistreatment and allegations of torture of individual Palestinians themselves through humiliating conduct, through physical violence, and through threats of sexual violence. The information I had did not include actual individuals claiming to have been sexually assaulted. However, there were subsequent cases that I've looked into.
Did you ask Israeli authorities to access to any of the facilities? And if so, what was their answer?
So I have not yet received a formal reply from the Israelis, but I have met them on 4 separate occasions to follow up on the cases of Palestinians, and have had briefings on an interim basis about changes that have been made, as well as making inquiries about why certain practices are continuing. I have requested a country visit to Israel. That is still, like many other countries, still under review. And importantly, I stress at all times that the access of the International Committee of the Red Cross in particular, but also other international observers, should be able to visit Palestinians in detention.
We have a couple of questions online. Ibtisam?
Hi, thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. I have also a follow-up on Palestine. The link we got from your report is actually the one from July. So in that report, you talk about, you welcome the decision by Israeli High Court to close the Sdeit Iman, the military detention center. But actually, so I'm not sure if you updated that, because as far as I know, in September, there was a court decision not to close that detention center. So could you say something to that? And then there were a lot of allegation of rape and sexual torture used against Palestinian detainees, not only in the last year, but also in past years. But in the last year, could you say more to that, given the fact that even Israeli right groups like B'Tselem published reports in which they investigated the issue in one of their reports that they called Welcome to Hell, in Israeli prison system as a network of torture camps. And they don't only talk about Sdeit Iman, they talk about other prisons. So could you say more to that too? Thank you.
I understand the Supreme Court issued a judgment and the Supreme Court continues to oversee not the closure of Sdeit Iman, and actually my present report was corrected, but the correction was too late to go into the report, so apologies for that. But that the facility itself the people in it would be moved to other facilities and or released. So it has slowly moved from large numbers of people down to, I don't have the figures, but I think it's in the 40s. It was built as a temporary military facility. In the context, more people than ever should have been put in this facility, and for periods longer than that they should have been in that facility. What I understand is from my engagement on this issue is that facility is going to be upgraded. I think there will need to be considerable upgrading in order to make it a more permanent facility. And I am aware that there continue to be the use of practices that clearly violate the prohibition on torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatments, such as constant blindfolding, stress positions, handcuffing for extended periods of time, overcrowding, degrading conditions and sanitary conditions. So all of those have been improved with the movement of people out. I have not been able to follow up on where those people have gone and whether they've gone to better facilities. I'm still working with some organisations on the ground who, as I said, do have access to those facilities. So that's what I can say on that. I am aware of reports of sexual violence. I have not received those allegations submitted to me on a formal basis. The information I had at the time in July was that there were threats. There was quite a regular practice of threatening sexual violence, but that those people, as part of those particular reports I reviewed, had not shown any actual cases. So that was one of the challenges I faced at that time, and why I would like to go and visit to be able to see for myself. I am following closely the case that has been reported on sexual violence. I understand, and I think my figures are correct, that there have been 46 open investigations by the Israelis into torture and other ill treatment, of which very few of them, as I understand it, have progressed to a level that is needed.
Just a quick follow-up, because when you say you don't have cases or people who represented to you with allegation of sexual torture or rape and etc., don't you also initiate investigation by yourself without only having people coming to you? I mean, the reports about these issues are not only all over the press, but they are also published by human rights organizations, including Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's a fair question. The procedure at the United Nations is that I am able to initiate my own inquiries, but I cannot submit allegations to myself. So they do need to come from people through a formal procedure. We are also not allowed to rely on media sources alone. So even if we have multiple media sources, we are not able to say whether they're the same information repeated over and over again and what the source is. So it's very important with a mandate like the mandate on torture and other inhuman treatment, is that every allegation is investigated thoroughly, that there are no, as best as possible, no false allegations put forward or no allegations that are that haven't been established to a reasonable degree of certainty. And that's so important, not just for the people that are victims and survivors of this, because they will be undermined if there are false allegations on the other hand, and that includes worldwide. So I continue to be engaged on the issue, and I'm continuing to follow up. And I invite submissions from other organisations, of which I haven't received any of late, which is interesting.
Thank you. We have another question online. Ridwan, do you mind unmuting yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Edwards. I have two questions. I would like to know what are the trends you're seeing in Africa? And secondly, your thoughts on reintegration efforts and psychosocial support, because we've seen quite some challenge with reintegration of, victims of torture.
Thank you very much for the question. I was actually just in Kenya a couple of weeks ago attending a hearing for Healing of Victims and Survivors of Torture, which is a project I am committed to every year, going to a different region, bringing in victims and survivors who apply to speak. And across Africa, I will bring their voices to this room. A lot of problems around political oppression, so the use of torture within that context to make people afraid to raise their voices. The number of democratic elections is sending shivers down the spines of many people who are former victims of torture or who have previously been politically active. Prison conditions across most parts of Africa are problematic. There are also some good practices and some good commitment to improve conditions. But generally, there's a real problem of substandard and undignified and overcrowded places of detention, and just a lot of work to do. On the positive side, I see an increasing interest and engagement across Africa to improve their conditions, to eradicate these old torture practices and to move to improving conditions for all. I always take note of the fact that every country in Africa, apart from 2, are now party to the Convention Against Torture, and many are now signing up to the optional protocol to the convention. So I think it's too difficult to talk about Africa, the continent overall, but there are countries that are making good strides. There's also some inconsistency in countries, so they may be making improvements in their prisons, but at the same time they may be oppressing people on the other hand around political processes. In terms of reintegration efforts, so my report also talks about this in the context of sexual torture, but more broadly, it's very, very important that victims and survivors are not only consulted as to what the future looks for them, but they are co-creators and they can design that with the authorities. Too many missteps happen when victims and survivors are not consulted and people think they're doing the right thing and they design some program and it's not appropriate. There are a wide number of highly specialist psychologists and psychiatrists working on this issue in various parts of Africa, who are well trained and qualified, and that's a real positive. But of course, way too many cases for them to be able to deal with, and the recovery from torture is a long-term process. And is not speedily resolved for individuals or their families or the community.
Please go ahead. Do you mind introducing yourself to the...
Thank you. Hanin from Occupied Palestine, Dag Hammarskjöld Fellow. I also want to ask about Palestinian prisons, especially Hamas prisons from Gaza after October 7, because, nobody wants to ask about them. And, their conditions are complicated. They are subjected all forms of torture, including sexual violence. Is there any plan to follow up on this issue?
Could you clarify? You said Hamas prisons.
Yes.
Can you?
Yes.
Could you say
Hamas
a bit
member
more?
who arrested from Gaza after 7 October.
But not people detained by Hamas in Gaza. You said Hamas prisons. So could you just
Hamas members from Gaza
detained where?
arrested by Israeli.
Okay, all right. No, I just wanted to make sure because the framing. I mean, I don't know what more I can add other than that I'm following up on the two tracks. One are the general, conditions, making sure people are well fed, looked after, they've got proper conditions, they've got appropriate bedding, etc. And that has reduced over the context since 7th of October. And on the other hand, looking into allegations as they arise in terms of torture and mistreatment, and engaging with the Israelis and also with the permanent mission in Geneva of the State of Palestine in order to minimize and to make sure the countries know that I'm following these issues. It's very hard and unsatisfactory not to be able to go and see for myself. I am trying to make that happen, and I think it would be important that that does happen, but that's kind of my strategy at this stage, to be able to be on the ground and to meet all relevant parties and have access to facilities.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Could I just ask a follow-up? In Gaza, we're seeing this phenomenon over the last year of Israeli soldiers, after entering a person's private home, going in and to women's private clothing areas and displaying undergarments of women. I think you've probably seen that. I saw an interview with a woman that was a victim of that, and she said, I felt like I was almost sexually assaulted in a way. Is this something that you've looked into at all, or how would you explain this phenomenon, or is it outside of the purview of your mandate?
Look, what I'd say is that, the rules of international law of armed conflict are clear. One needs to treat people with dignity and humanity. One needs to respect the private spaces of individuals and civilians. I have seen some of the documentation of that. And undisciplined soldiers who commit such acts of degradation should be disciplined. There should be investigations carried out. None of these acts that we see are acceptable, and nor were the attacks of October the 7th by Hamas. This dehumanization from both sides, this lack of understanding of each other, creates space for these acts to occur that wouldn't otherwise occur. That's not an excuse for them at all. And it does no service to the to any future prospects for peace. Both Hamas and other armed groups, as well as the Israelis, need to obey international law. They are all subject to it. People need to be swiftly removed from the zone if they've been found to commit these things, and investigated fully and impartially. And IHL should be respected in all accounts.
Do we have any other questions? I don't see any online. Thank you again, Dr. Edwards, for your briefing.